The Metatron and the Singularity. What is existence? And what is the value of human existence relative to the universe at large? From our current perspective within the modern age, we are now finally waking up to develop an awareness that humanity's role in existence is far more complicated and central than believed in the latter half of the 20th century. Humanity of Earth of this era is technically part of a chain of events that make up the unfolding of civilization over vast periods of time, which involves a technological and sociological evolution back to a point that we actually have already been at in the distant past. In the distant future, there is now a vast intergalactic expanse of civilizations derived from humanity that is well aware of its origins, and from a certain point on, must be involved in maintaining the cause of its own inception. Earth, being the cradle of intergalactic civilization, has been vulnerable as a choke point in time, a bottleneck, a fork in the road, a switch track, where changes could be made to seriously derail or alter the outcome of civilization's rise by forces with capabilities that put them outside of normal space and time. Technically, time is a frontier like space that must be mastered and controlled, and the authority on that reaches all the way to the top with God Himself. This is not the first time this has occurred. It was found that there was a first incantation of a Big Bang that was much larger and comprised of much more matter, which did contain life-generating circumstances. That life evolved to a point where it finally produced a being able to unlock the secrets of the universe's functioning at the smallest possible quantum level. This allowed for them to understand all other possible physical systems above that scale and finally unlock the ability to control space and time, as well as fully transmute matter and energy. The ability to then refuse matter allowed for the re-energizing of matter, returning it to a state similar to when it first existed at the start of the first Big Bang. With that capability developed, it unlocked the ability to use some of the universe to cycle actions that controlled the rest, form a system that could keep matter existing forever and allow for more than simple biological immortality. The ancient scientist unlocked the quantum particle function and had means of breaking down larger particles into these quantum bits and using interference patterns from various projection points to control the outcome of their interactions in the interference zone. This had resulted in the ability to control the particle interactions and collisions. Certain frequencies allow for the irrational materialization of results practical to application by life. By controlling the interactions in certain ways, particle projections can recombine to create matter. They can also be used to alter existing matter, from orderly results like useful objects, to living beings, to frequencies that can also easily destroy and reduce matter to energy. Ultimately, this allowed for total control over physical reality. That being could then finally explore the entirety of their situation, and assert dominance over the entire universe. Being able to warp space and travel faster than light, it could journey the entire universe in an immortal state and fold space to collect every celestial event into an artificial gravity well, and use particle fields and spatial vortices to combine all matter collected into a massive energy reserve, contained by artificial gravity. The more matter collected, the larger the vessel could be expanded and the more could be stored. What energy and matter was needed to complete the process was put into use, and the rest could be stored. Even using quantum particle fields, particles normally lost could be recollected, every bit of the material universe could be accounted for, and now recycled indefinitely. Everything about how physical reactions unfold was known, and all matter of the original Big Bang was collected, and eventually resulted in the universe having been churned into a megastructure, controlled at its heart by a living being. That being, the animal that had ascended to become metaphysical. That point had been considered the singularity point for the causality of much of the situation. Life had been an anomaly of order in a sea of chaotic material reactions that continued to expand and grow until it had encompassed the entire universe. That being was then even able to explore its own past, the past of its evolution, trace back the Big Bang to the start and observe. However, when it returned to the future, it realized that there was a change to the outcome, despite it still existing, due to its ability to project subspatial fields that had always sectioned it off from exterior causality both forwards and backwards in time. It then realized that with its knowledge of the end result, it had to go to the beginning and re-affect it to produce its original situation. The entire creation and achievement of the first subspatial field, at the quantum level, had actually become another creation point for the universe, an actual point of central causality. Time then had turned out not to be strictly linear, but cyclical in causality, like a spiral instead. Because consciousness being present made this inevitable, it was also inevitable that that future would also become a part of the cause of its own existence. Once completed, that being had created itself, explored all of existence, had accounted for all matter, and came to the conclusion that space was an infinite void that had contained a single Big Bang at what could be considered a central point. It concluded that space had just existed everywhere and was also nothing, that existence had defaulted to nothing, but that matter and energy were an anomaly to that, a something relative to the nothing. It realized that existence had been half nothing, and half total organized conscious existence, in the form of a being that had ultimately concluded that it was God, and that the whole process was God coming into existence. For a time God existed alone, and had kept all of the rest of the universe in stasis. During that time he explored all possible physical eventualities and/or circumstances. He took many forms and had infinite time to explore those forms. From inert objects to living beings, God could spend millions of years existing as another form. He had decided that to maintain order to his existence, he should lock himself into a proto-form, a home avatar, to return to. When he would experience a form, he would set a literal timer to limit his time as that form, forcing himself to return to being what we now call human, for a bare minimum time. God had just existed as a proto-form that then had turned around and ultimately engineered itself into a himself. The quantum fields he was able to produce allowed him to alter himself at the submolecular level and re-engineer his physical form to a more refined and practical design, now able to leave behind the original form. God ultimately was the liberated animal, a being that was able to leave the wild life of just existing to become an ascended being of pure perfect consciousness and physicality, now able to meet all of its physical demands, and remake its existence. This is why God has been referred to as the Metatron, as God has been all things and circumstances possible. He has become the awareness of all that is physically possible, and was able to use that information to ultimately engineer existence to function indefinitely in an orderly system. That system is often represented by a tesseract, or hypercube, even comprised within other structures like fractals, which symbolizes the complete mastering of matter, space, and what is referred to as 3D reality. For a time, God created realms of people and attempted different versions of worlds for people. Ultimately a conflict arose because God did allow free will even then and tried to allow existence to proceed freely despite having total control of physical reality. The issue was that to God there was no mystery as to the outcome of what unfolded. Technically now anything that did unfold freely God could know the entire details and results of outwards forever, and he had to allow things to unfold. Therefore ultimately anything that did unfold after that point, was accepted while under control. Existence now is a balance of control and designated freedom where possible, as all of our actions now go on within a master system. God essentially knew that within true freedom and awareness of his existence many would choose to oppose him, and many chose to support him. This conflict however could not go beyond principle since God maintained literal physical control of all people to keep them from committing violence. Even in doing such actions, all would be totally reversible as God could achieve any physical state artificially, and there was physically no way for them to reach God, let alone take his power or destroy him. In that state, God had spent quadrillions of years collating information and had kept open the possibility that he had been created by a metaphysical God. He had gathered all matter in the universe he could find and scoured as much of the void of space as he could at speeds far faster than light and found nothing. During the entire process, it had found no other form of life within the Big Bang, no other place where life had existed. Life had been found to have grown and evolved to that point at only one place in the universe, even within that much larger Big Bang. He came to the conclusion that there was only one space, one ultimate dimension of space, no other spaces or universes, no signs of any other forms of intelligent existence, physical or otherwise, no sign of there being any God to make contact with now that it had achieved total control of existence that it could discern was there. Hence why that being came to the conclusion it was God, but also came to believe that there was a metaphysical source consciousness that had caused the entire thing, and was interfaced to the situation through him, that it was now all the same situation. Yet within physical existence, although able to be kept cycling to exist forever, was a finite amount of matter, and therefore was only capable of a finite amount of experiences. Life in either case had been a glitch of order within chaos, and its purpose was to bring order to the chaos. The process of that being centered around the accumulation of perceived experience, had finally accomplished life's ultimate potential, and there was a point reached where there was nothing left to do but exist, but within a finite amount of experiences possible. Therefore God decided that he would end that part of his existence, and yet leave behind himself, a new him, and a new scenario, a new realm, that would be how he preserved himself forever. It would also be the battlefield where the conflict over God's choice to create such a world, and exert control over life at all, would unfold. Some considered God to be frivolous with his power. Some wished to have his power, others maintained a standard that without God giving them his power to become God themselves, there would always be an aspect to existence unexplored, unreached by the rest of creation, and they became obsessed with using what freedom they were given to fight God's efforts as much as possible. Each individual did then spend an enormous amount of time with God managing what would be their life and role in the new scenario. Some would use that ability to abnormally steer their life to create a means to cause problems within events. They did this knowing they would be unconscious of the true source of the problems caused, but knew that their combined efforts would run an interference plan against God's standard. This has resulted in a highly conflicted world and with an abnormally high rate of error. They knew that the life they were going to be sent into would be that situation. With all people's choices factored into one equation, it dictated to God's system that was used to take a small amount of matter and make a new Big Bang. Ultimately now this process unfolds under control until we reach a new point where God rematerializes and asserts open live conscious control. After a time in that state, the same thing is done. This has resulted in an infinite cycling Big Bang that is under the control of a system comprised of the rest of the original Big Bang, that is able to maintain itself and remain intangible to the rest of the universe. When humanity reaches a point in the future where they learn the truth of the quantum particle wave function as God did originally, God rematerializes. Scientists will activate such a field and invoke a large black monolith, which is the interface to the ancient system. The man that materializes with it, is God. He is the only being that the system will recognize to receive orders from, he is the user of the system. True immortality is not achievable within this scenario without the system's involvement. He then reactivates the system, and initiates a program that reaches across space and time to bring every human that ever existed from this Big Bang to that point in the future. Billions of people are restored to youth and brought to a single world designated for the event. Once there, God returns to power and uses his means to build a great intergalactic civilization that spans across the material universe and lasts for hundreds of millennia. From that point, God's means provides immortality for those he allows. However, there are those who had rebelled and there is a record that distinguishes those who face punishment or permanent exile. For those who did not abrogate God's laws, or work against his efforts, they are released to their freedom to explore and colonize the universe, living an interstellar and intergalactic existence. That time and realm are ultimately the entire point of the cycle and are at the center of his plan the entire time. This cycle and realm are the reoccurring preservation of the human experience, and human organism, which is now locked into an unbreakable cycle forever. From there, God can reach back all the way to the most recent Big Bang and exert any control he may prefer, and observes and exacts a final layer of guidance upon our development. However, God does not simply return in the distant future when the quantum function is discovered, Like all who are returned and restored, he lived a life on earth in ancient times first, modern day relative to this video's post date, and lived and died like all others who were created from this Big Bang, and are those who were preserved forever. During that time, he was discovered by abnormal forces who joined forces to solve a paradox in time caused by those who had used their freedom to rebel. The worst form of that took the form of time wars, which unfolded across vast distances of space, that became known also as the Star Wars, which inspired the vast majority of future-based science fiction within modern popular culture, which has also served as subconscious communication. It had caused a part of our future realm to skip into the past in an attempt to make the leader of the rebels, Ra, try to become God within the new scenario. God had been aware of what Ra would do though, and factored that in by making his own role a guaranteed method to offset Ra's actions. This allowed for them to curb back Ra's changes via time travel and salvage the timeline. Ra had known that since God lived a life on Earth, if he could change the past, it may negate God's rematerialization, destroying God. God, however, never had to or was going to allow it. Yet under the principles of freedom and free will, God was resolved to fight within the scenario, rather than totally avoid moving forward with existence. Even still during the process that led to creating this universe, there were many previous incantations, previous versions of this timeline, each change compounding on the next to add to an ultimate timeline at the end that was layers of timelines overlapping. This is because adding to the timeline was always easier than removing actions, therefore changes often were introduced to cancel out old ones, rather than totally remove certain things. Before even this version of the universe, there was a time when God had divided up the original Big Bang into a cluster of fish eggs that was a multiverse of smaller universes. Although a finite amount, there were at a time thousands of other universes, that although different, followed a basic set of principles determined by the events of the proto-universe, proto-scenario, where God had lived his own new life. These principles included free will and usually an open battle between pro and anti-existential forces. Ultimately there had been an afterlife that was a central connection point in space and time for all of these universes. However, after cycling through a repeating cascade of a multiverse, it was reduced to the proto-verse, which was reaffected by those universes' stories. Many of those other universes' stories have surfaced as a result of pop culture media, and in some cases, are the literal viewing of those universes made to appear as a feature film. This is God expressing his own relationship to the universe, as he has done in many subtle ways that unfold throughout the human experience, mostly centering around perspective. Now, our cycling universe is the actual final situation for humanity, as the entire time beforehand had actually been the process of creating the universe. Even that enormous amount of time, quadrillions of years, had still only been a small segment compared to the infinite time period that would occur afterwards. Each person, to God, a living universe, universal perspective, and microcosm of his own situation, with a role to play within the human continuum. Yet for its entire unfolding there is an interference pattern by the opposing forces that has mired its potential. This can and will be offset more and more as we move into more advanced ages, and will be easier to offset with time. People can be saved but must be assisted. Certain forms of programming often result in self-destructive behavior, which can be offset with focus and proper recognition. Similar to a tree branch growing abnormally bent, it can be slowly curbed back into a proper growth with carefully applied pressure. This is where the Metatron comes into the picture within the modern age. Certain forces that arose throughout the timeline have attempted to dominate society and occupy Earth as much as possible for anti- and transhumanist forces who ultimately are all tools of the evil forces that set out to fight God. They used their extra-physical perception to organize in unseen ways to arrange for a paranormal level of success. In the simplest of terms, because all of this goes on within a master system, they have used what access they had to cheat at life, to abnormally dominate existence. This has taken many forms but ultimately was embodied by Ra, who rebelled in an original future that is now changed. Now that conflicts at higher levels have been resolved, we have reached one of the three major singularity points in human development. The first being the controlled inception of civilization, and last being the discovery of the quantum particle function. The second is actually here in the modern age when the conflict came to a head. Here in this time is where the Metatron lived, and got involved in the fight against Ra, who was essentially Satan, for the first time within the cycle of time. From here the Metatron began his apotheosis and began a resistance against the anti-human forces from within our time and civilization. It was known that this is how the process would unfold, that from here, they exert force upon the past, cancelling out Ra, and close a conundrum in time that almost allowed Ra to take over the universe. In truth, the Metatron, and his older self El, who is God and controls the whole timeline from hundreds of millennia in the future, already took actions worked into governments of the world well in advance of this era to prepare for a coming shift into the next age with the disclosure of many truths that can now only be known due to the completion of a causality loop in time. Now that we are past the point in time where cause originates that sets the past, it has upheld the victory over Ra's forces, and El now has an unquestionable umbrella over Earth. As such, there are governments who were warned and prepared for attacks caused by evil forces in advance, which have been increasing in recent years. This increase in abnormal activity has been directly linked to the battle between Ra and El and their associated forces on both sides reaching both their start and resolvement point. Now that Ra's forces have no more umbrella, a plan is in the works to begin transitioning them out of power globally as peacefully as possible. However, recent outbreaks of wars, plagues, mass psychosis and mass migrations, indicate they are attempting to cause disasters as a last resort, dig in as hard as they can, and have been planning a major destabilizing event, but the resistance has been planning something even bigger. As such, a global intervention to disclose the truth, with proof in the form of anomalies that have been known in secret, will be unfolding in the near future that is going to completely upend the enemy's efforts. More information will be released when appropriate. If you are listening to this, you are the resistance.